February of 1429, in the war-torn lands of the Kingdom of France. In the context of 100 Years' War, a joint force of Englishmen and Burgundians were laying siege to the French-held city of Orléans. The capture of this city was the key to the English dominion over the south of the River Loire, but the siege lasted 6 months already, and by the looks of it, it could very well last another 6. After the defeat of the French relief army at the Battle of the Herrings, it became clear that the siege wouldn't be lifted anytime soon. The bastard of Orléans, who had been entrusted with the defense of the city, sent a surrender offer to the besiegers. However, this interesting proposal had unforeseen consequences for the city. The bastard had offered to surrender the city not to the English, but to the Burgundians, as a neutral territory in the conflict. This was still a victory for the English, as they would be able to use Orléans to cross into the south of the Loire, but prevented their complete dominance over the city. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip III, who had been searching for a diplomatic solution to the 100 Years' War since before the siege began, pressed the English commanders to accept the offer, but they were sure the city would soon fall. Hence, the Duke of Bedford, highest English authority in France, refused the offer. This was the last in a long history of diplomatic disagreements between Philip III of Burgundy and the Duke of Bedford, and as a result, Philip III withdrew his 1,500 men from the besieging force, with only 4,000 men remaining. The offer of the bastard of Orléans, originally intended to mitigate the consequences of the surrender, had actually divided the enemy and weakened the position of the besiegers. Now that it was clear that there would be no surrender, the French began assembling a relief force once more, this time at the city of Blois. Over the last few years, a prophecy had been circulating about a maiden in armor who would rid France from the iron fist of the English. Hence, when Joan d'Arc, a 17-year-old girl donning a suit of plate armor, appeared in the French camp at Blois, the morale of the soldiers was lifted and their hearts filled with courage. Jeanne claimed to be guided by the voices of angels, and that the will of God was to see the Dauphin Charles crowned King of France. The staunch resolve of the young lady is best represented by the letter she sent to the Duke of Bedford before her march to Orléans. You, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the Kingdom of France, hand over to the maiden the keys to all the towns you have taken. And if you do not do so, I am a commander, and wherever I come across your troops in France, I shall make them go, whether willingly or unwillingly, and if they will not obey, I will have them wiped out. On the 29th of April of 1429, Jeanne d'Arc entered the city of Orléans, greeted by the cheers of the crowd. For the next 5 days, she strolled along the city, distributing food to the people and salaries to the garrison, which raised the morale of the defenders. At the same time, the French commanders were occupied ensuring the different battalions of reinforcements entered the city safely. On May the 4th, the bastard of Orléans arrived with the last of the relief contingents. At this point of the siege, the defense of the city was led by the bastard of Orléans, La Hire, and Jeanne d'Arc, while the English were led by William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, John Talbot, and William Glasdale on the southern bank of the River Loire. The mastering of the forces was complete, and the military actions that ensued would define the outcome of the Siege of Orléans. The very same day the bastard arrived with the last reinforcements, he marched out of Orléans with 1,500 men towards the English-held Bastille of Saint-Loup. This fortification was on the northern bank of the Loire and overlooked the road to the eastern gate of the city. The 400-strong English garrison was the only thing preventing the defenders from securing a steady flow of supplies from the east. Therefore, the Bastard of Orléans launched his forces upon the walls of the fortress with full force. The English defenders fought for their lives, hurling every kind of projectile available. As the French ladders reached the walls, an overwhelming tide of attackers fell upon the fortification. Despite their overwhelming numbers, the initial French assault on Saint-Loup was unsuccessful, and the men of the Bastard of Orléans pulled back from the battlements. The Bastard of Orléans hadn't informed Jeanne of his plan to take Saint-Loup, so the maiden only set out from Orléans when the battle had already started. By the time she arrived at Saint-Loup, the first wave of Frenchmen had been repelled. In spite of the desperation that reigned among the waves of soldiers, Jeanne raised her banner high and galloped across the plain, assuring them that God was by their side and appealing to their honor as warriors. When the demoralized Frenchmen witnessed the young lady with a valiant gesture on her horse, they stopped on their tracks and rallied under the banner of the maiden. With their morale renewed, the French contingent once more rushed the walls of the Saint-Loup Bastille, this time with zealous courage. Jeanne herself dismounted and joined the assault, climbing the ladders to join her men in battle. Before nightfall, the fortress of Saint-Loup had fallen in French hands. The following day, May the 5th, was Ascension Day, and no fighting took place. The French spent the day replenishing their forces, and at night, the leadership of Orléans gathered in a war council. Jeanne, with her characteristic zeal, insisting on launching an all-out assault on the English headquarters, heavily guarded at the fortress of Saint-Laurent. In contrast, the Bastard of Orléans, counselled by the Duke of Alençon, vouched for a more defensive approach, aiming to starve the besiegers out. In sight of this disagreement, another of the French leaders, the famed La Hire, came up with an intermediate plan. They would clear the weaker southern bank of the Loire of any English garrisons, allowing the city to resupply indefinitely from the south, thus thwarting the siege. The 6th of May opened up with lots of activity by the defenders. The fighting force of the defenders left the eastern gate and crossed the river via a makeshift pontoon bridge across which several artillery pieces were also brought. Aware that if they remained spread they would be picked apart, the English had abandoned all the surrounding forts of the southern bank of the Loire and gathered in the centric monastery of Les Augustines. If the French succeeded in taking the fortified monastery, the English would have no option left but to retreat to Les Tourelles. Therefore, on the afternoon of the 6th of May, the French army under the Bastard of Orléans prepared the assault on Les Augustines. Once more, siege ladders advanced upon the walls of the English bastion, and once more, the valiant Joan of Arc led the assault. The Maiden of Orléans reached the top of the wall with her men, and the ensuing fight was brutal. The struggle for Les Augustines is recalled by some accounts as the bloodiest battle in the war since Agincourt. Waves upon waves of zealous Frenchmen fell upon the walls, and eventually the English were forced to give ground. As soon as the top of the wall was secured, the French crossbowmen climbed the ladders. They stationed themselves on the highest points of the fortification and began raining projectiles on the retreating garrison. At this point, Jeanne's men swarmed the inner courtyard of the monastery, and the final stand of the English took place. Just before nightfall, Les Augustines had been taken. In one day, the forces of the Bastard of Orléans, bolstered by the presence of the fiery Joan of Arc, had cleared almost the entirety of the southern bank of the Loire. The remaining English forces were stationed at the gatehouse of Les Tourelles, which had been taken by the Earl of Salisbury at the beginning of the siege. The otherwise small bastion of Les Tourelles was fortified by a wide ring of earthworks and wooden fortifications. The remaining Englishmen, under the command of William Glassdale, couldn't count on high stone walls this time, but they would employ Glassdale's heaviest knights and most talented fighters. On the morning of the 7th of May, the definitive assault on Les Tourelles would take place. The French troops gathered on the southern bank, and once more, Joan of Arc would lead the charge. Jeanne was among the first to enter the trench and held the banner high for her soldiers to see. With their morale bolstered, the besieged fought fiercely, and the English now defended the very same fortification they had taken 6 months before till their last breath. while the Maiden of Orléans stood on the earthworks, waving her flag and urging her men to charge the breach and fight, disaster struck. A longbow arrow had landed between her neck and shoulder, and she had to be dragged out of the fight. Soon, the rumor spread that the Maiden of Orléans had been killed, demoralizing the French and encouraging the English. The hours went by and the attackers rallied and charged the enemy again and again, but to no avail. By the afternoon, none of the assaults on Les Tourelles had been fruitful. As dusk was approaching, the bastard pulled his troops back to rest for the day. However, to his disbelief, the Maiden of Orléans appeared, proudly dressed in her armor and with her banner held high. She had been wounded a few hours ago, and yet now she urged the advance with the strength of a lioness. The battered French soldiers were encouraged by the appearance of Jeanne and gathered their resolve for a last fight. Indeed, the last assault of the French, guided by the Maiden of Orléans, was too much pressure for the defenders to bear. As his men were slaughtered left and right, William Glasdale retreated to the stone towers of Les Tourelles via a wooden drawbridge. But many were the English who tried to fall back with him, which, coupled with the damages of the enemy bombardment, caused the bridge to give in. Glasdale and his men fell into the river Loire and drowned. As the morning of the 8th of May arrived, the southern bank, as well as the fortifications of Les Tourelles, were back in French hands for the first time since the siege had begun. The citizens immediately got to repairing the bridge, which meant that Orléans could now be resupplied indefinitely from the south. Therefore, there was little point for the English to continue the siege, and after a brief standoff, the Earl of Suffolk and John Talbot abandoned the city. Orléans was free. After 6 months of encirclement, a 17-year-old peasant girl had been the key to liberating Orléans in only 4 days of fighting. Jeanne d'Arc would go on to meet with the Dauphin of France and plan a campaign to liberate the Loire from all English and Burgundian influence. If you stayed until the end and enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to my small channel for weekly Total War documentaries. I script, record, and narrate everything by my own means, so if you could leave a like and comment as a form of support, I would be immensely grateful. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.